When bank economists predict that house prices will fall, is it time to put your property search on hold and wait for a crash?
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Megan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mums. But that's a good thing because between us we've got over 40 years experience and we are going to share with you bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure that you get unbiased and real information that you can rely on so you can get where you want to be without missing a step.
Now, we've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll find free checklists that you can download, a free mini course on how to price a property, and our Where to Buy workshop for only $39. Priceless stuff, really.
Bargain. But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You, of course, know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field of expertise. Now, we've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change. So check with the relevant government authority or your advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today, we're talking about the property cycle and what smart buyers do when the clock's about to strike 12. But before we get into that, do you like that line, Megan?
Makes me laugh because I imagine there's a lot of people out there going, what property? What? Clock? 12? What? We might have to clarify that.
All will be revealed. Right, before we get into it, of course, what's your special house this week, Megan? You're sitting in front of something that looks like a hill with a rock on it.
There is a house under that grass. So I've been a little bit interested. For those of you who tune in to watch on YouTube, I always have an interesting house. Sometimes they're quirky, unique. Sometimes they just have blown my socks off. I just realised I can't actually say the name of this particular house. It's in Scotland is all I'm going to say. It's the Brochs of Cloghark. That's the wrong accent entirely.
And it's, I've got Scottish heritage. I mean, look at my colouring. Hey, but now I've got Buckleys who've actually been able to pronounce that
I really should have tried to work out how to say that first. But anyhow, it's in Scotland. And this house was designed with a grassy roof and it regulates the temperature. So a little cooler in summer, a little warmer in winter. And I just love the way it's one of those few houses that actually does fit into the landscape. You know how sometimes you see on grand designs or something, and the house is meant to assimilate and, just be calmly part of the hillside, and it's sticking out like a sore thumb. This one really actually does look like it belongs there because they've used really large rocks as part of the exterior. And it really, I don't know that there'd be a lot of natural light in there, Veronica, but it's a beautiful, interesting home in the hill.
Looks a little bit like, the Wombles. Do you remember the Wombles when you were a kid? It's like a Womble would live in a Womble would live in that. So that's for our older listeners. It certainly blends into the hillside, and it's a little bit like a grotto, like it's sort of like cavey type thing. But I just can't help but wonder who needs to have cool air in summer in Scotland. I thought Scotland's summer was like our winter.
I think the warming aspect would be the most important one anyway.
Very, very important. All right, so let's kick on with the topic of today.
Yeah. It's a common reaction when there are negative headlines. We have so many property-related headlines that in one news edition, you can have, prices set to skyrocket and prices set to crumble in the one publication. But talk of interest rate rises, that you might be tempted to put your property search on hold and wait to see if prices will fall. But Veronica, I'm not so sure that that's the direction that we think people should be going.
No, and look, if you've listened to enough of our stuff, you'll know that we're not property people that go, oh, you can only go up. It's the only way, just get on the ladder. We are very highly critical thinkers and certainly very, very cognizant, very aware that the property market will at some point fall. I mean, because the whole country's been on this basically upward trajectory, unless you're basically in a city apartment in Brisbane, Melbourne, or Sydney, pretty much, but Darwin,
or unfortunately and very sadly, flood affected properties now.
Oh yeah,
we're in the middle of March, and of course there have been so many properties that have suffered significant inundation, and those properties will have a drop in their prices. There's no doubt about it.
So that's maybe we need to have another topic. That's another episode actually about what happens in those areas. And I guess that's a very good example.
I'm on Martin North on the 12th of April, and that's what he wants to focus on, is what's going to happen to prices and flood-related properties.
And I think what we need to talk about is due diligence as well, because the reality is that you can avoid buying in a flood area. It's actually really easy to avoid. Yeah. And I'm actually amazed. I know we've just gone right off topic, but I'm amazed because I remember filming the show up in Brisbane, because it was a 2011, wasn't it? Your last huge big floods.
The last big one, yeah.
And I remember filming a year later, and you honestly wouldn't see too much evidence of a year later, you didn't see much evidence of there being these devastating floods, but it was very much in people's psyche. But then about 5 years after that,
it was fresh at that point.
Yeah, it was no longer in the psyche after 5 years though.
Yep.
And we have short memories. So yeah, but anyway, back on to.
We digress, but there is so much that we do need to talk about in that topic. So that's what we're going to record next week.
There you go. Okay, so, but the markets do sort of rise and fall, right? And even though over long periods of time, when you look at charts of the Australian property market, Sydney property market, Brisbane property market, et cetera, you'll see that prices do trend upwards, but there's going to be little peaks and troughs sort of along that upward trajectory. And I'm not talking about individual properties here. I'm talking about sort of the market, the whole
wrapped up markets, which of course we know doesn't exist.
No. However, when you bundle everything in together, you can just sort of see what happens en masse in an aggregate. The thing is that you definitely don't want to get caught out when prices fall. And there'll be lots and lots of headlines when they do, because that's what it was like for 2018 and half of 2019. And what we want to talk about today is what actually happens when the market turns, and give you some case studies from previous peaks, because I like to collect this stuff.
You most certainly do. I was just doing a quick little Google search for a property clock, because I feel like I want to clarify that for people. One thing about property cycles is that despite all the uncertainty in the world, buyer behaviour follows a reasonably similar pattern. And supply and demand, of course, is one of the underlying factors that influences buyer behaviour. But just in terms of that property clock, really quickly, what it is a way of a graphical representation of where different markets are according to whether they're peaking, which is 12 o'clock.
12 o'clock
is a peaking market, whether they're declining, which is 3 o'clock, whether they're at the bottom or bottoming out, which is 6 o'clock, or whether they're rising, which is 9 o'clock, and each point in between. And what property forecasters try to do is anticipate where on the clock we actually are. Now, the thing we want people to remember is nobody can pick when a market is going to peak and where it's going to fall. So it's a guesstimate. You can only know when those two things have happened after they've happened, and you're actually on the other side of them. So we talk about a property clock and where we are. If some of these markets are moving towards 12 o'clock, we won't actually know when 12 o'clock has happened until we're heading towards 1 o'clock.
Yes, that's true. And then if it's a really tough, a tough falling market, you'll have certain analogies used, such as trying to catch a falling knife. How graphic is that?
Wow.
And, and FOMO turns to FONGO, fear of missing out turns to fear of not getting out. And so it becomes quite dramatic, right? So
we're talking about property here.
But it's human behavior, right? So,
yeah, it is.
I mean, look, markets peak and trough, right? But they don't actually follow a set pattern. I mean, this property clock is a nice idea, but there's lots of variations within it. And not all markets are actually in sync with each other. And nobody actually knows for sure until it's happened, like Megan was just saying. But there's times when, even at the end of last year, Brisbane was the strongest market in the country. Other markets aren't doing as well. So it's never the same everywhere. But if we sort of just run through the general sort of clock, if you like, what happens? So I don't know, between 9 and 12 o'clock, FOMO, fear of missing out, prices go crazy. And then they get to a point where they sort of get too far, and then you'll start to see negative headlines. And then you'll start to see buyers getting nervous.
And people coming out of the woodwork, banks saying property prices are going to fall, forecasters, the taxi driver, the Uber driver, everything's going to drop. Once you get advice from the Uber driver, it's time to turn off.
And one of the reasons, if you ask some of these Uber drivers, why do you think it's going to fall? They go, because it can't keep going. And it's like, actually, that's sort of right, but that's sort of completely wrong as well. That's yes, it won't keep going at the crazy 25% growth in Sydney last year. That's way too steep. That just can't keep going. But that's not the reason that it stops. It's
and what we're talking about here are indicators, aren't they? They're things that we start to see in our 20 odd years in property. These are the things that we start to see when a market is heading towards a peak. They're indicators. Yeah. Buyers start getting a bit nervous. So where we might have seen 30 or 40 groups going through an open house and that resulting in 10 or 12 offers, buyers start to just step back a little bit and say, I don't know about, I don't know. I just need a little bit of time to think about this, rather than what has been happening in around that 9 o'clock heading towards 12 o'clock, where people are just, if we miss out on this, we're going to be looking for 6 months. This is the closest we can get. Let's throw everything, including this kitchen sink, at it. And that's what pushes prices so dramatically, is that there are more people out there who want anything sometimes compared to what's actually available for sale. And the interesting thing at the moment is there are more transactions taking place in most markets than in any other peaking period, but there are so many more buyers than there has been in previous periods, which is why the demand is actually driving up. So the transactions are there. It's not like there's a lack of stock. There's just more buyers than there is stock.
Yeah, and there also is the thing is that the vendors start putting their property on the market. When these negative headlines start hitting, they start putting their property on the market because they think, oh, God, the peak's about now. I need to put my property on the market because I might miss it. I might miss the boat. So they do that. And then often they then start to outstrip the market in terms of their expectations. Sometimes
expectations.
Yeah. Yep. So if buyers do start getting
get
nervous,
a crazy price, I'll sell it. Yeah.
And they start getting the buyers start getting nervous, and they start sitting back and they start thinking, I'm not going to compromise on that main road home anymore. Or I'm not going to buy that one that's got the south facing garden. Oh, wait, because look, there's more stock coming on the market and I can actually be picky again. But those owners of properties that are compromised properties, often they don't recognise, or even if they do, they just think that somebody should pay stupid money for them. And so you'll start to see that those properties start passing in. And that's what we're seeing, that the C grade, all the agents are saying to me, it's just normal times. A grade property is competitive. B's got 1 or maybe 2 buyers on it. We'll sell that prior to auction, and the C's are passing in. So the clearance rates fall. The days on markets for those properties that actually are private treaty and not going to auction, they get longer. So it takes longer to sell each property. Then that feeds into more negative feedback, more or less buyer confidence. And that continues until the property market is perceived to be good value again. Then buyers start buying. We go beyond 6 o'clock. We start going to 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, back up to 9 o'clock, and the whole thing starts all over again.
Yes. And it is a reasonably predictable cycle. But I know that you and I have both found that over the last 20 years, the length of those cycles is actually getting shorter. And a lot of that is driven by an increased interest in property generally, but low interest rates, which gives people a greater affordability to get into the market. But also it is almost like there's a psyche that says, I am not successful until I own a property. So the pressure, the social pressure to actually participate in the property market and be an owner of a property is driving more buyers in that might have previously been a little bit footloose and fancy free and travelled more. And COVID certainly has had an impact on that as well, because less people are working overseas. They are putting down their roots and buying property in Australia. So it's actually brought more people to the marketplace than we would normally see at a home buying age or an investing age.
And because more people have saved money throughout the lockdowns as well.
Yeah,
so
nowhere to travel.
I've actually got money in the bank. I might do something with it.
Yeah.
You know, late in last year, 2021, the headlines started talking about falling prices. We started noticing that. But in spring, particularly in Sydney, I don't know about in Brizzy so much, in Sydney and Melbourne definitely, the property market often slows down. And if you go back to our episode, interviewed you and Jared McCabe, who's a buyer's agent from Melbourne at the end of last year, we talked about this, the cyclical or the seasonal, I should say, rather than cyclical. So you sort of got to, it is quite complicated because you got to try to work out, well, what is seasonal versus what is cyclical? And then many experts, in the middle of last year were predicting that the market would peak before Christmas. And so they were, but, we're recording this in March 2022, and even while growth has slowed, Sydney's only just shown a tiny little growth this year, and it's actually shown its first negative month in 17 months. Right?
Oh, but the headlines around that were phenomenal.
I know. It's like, it's all in the toilet now.
On that one.
So we went up 25% last year, guys. It's just so. I mean, this is the thing. They jump all over that, but the reality is that there will be people that have bought too close to the peak and have paid too much. And if they've bought a C-grade property, and their circumstances change, they could lose money. Absolutely. But that's not what the people who listen to this podcast are going to do.
No, but it's something that we talk about, and it's not just a market cycle thing. It is any point in time, and we are going to do that flood one because it's very important. They are C-grade properties, and a few people have said to me, Megan, is now the time to bag a bargain from a flood affected property? And I cannot tell you how many times I've had this conversation and talked about the fact that the last time we had such a rapidly rising market that flood affected properties were deemed by buyers to be of equal value to non-flood affected properties was in 2002. So it took 20 years for the prices to be considered equal, but within that time we've had three major floods. So what has happened to those properties is they've done this, and then they've had one peak. So you have to be prepared to ride out more price drops and downturns in order to get to this peak. But if you didn't sell that flood affected property during that peak before this flood, you've just gone down again, because they are the ones that are going to drop significantly in value. I don't know anyone who can time a market that well.
We say property is a long game, but when you have a dud asset, you got to get the hell out of it.
Get rid of it.
Because you're right. It's a roller coaster, and the experts can't time it, right?
I can't time it. I can see lead indicators, and I can talk about lead indicators, and you can see them in your marketplace as well. And we're not talking about the Australian property market because it doesn't exist. It's just a way to grab headlines. We're talking about local markets, suburb by suburb and property by property. So we can see indicators around those things and behaviour changes. But, I can't sit there hand on heart and go, well, buy that cheap property now and hold it for 20 years and you'll actually make some money out of it. You may not.
That's where the focus is too much on the discount, right? The price versus the quality of the asset. And look, I've had the same thing. So in Sydney, it's not so much, I want to buy a flood affected property, I'll get a bargain. It's, might be time to buy a 1-bedroom apartment in the city. It's just like, no, they weren't good before. They're still not good. Yeah. Nothing
They're just
changed.
Overpriced at the moment.
Because
they will come back.
No, they're cheap.
Oh, they're cheap.
Yeah, they're cheap. And it's like, I take advantage of somebody else's misfortune. That's really what that's about. The ambulance chasing
ambulance chasers,
property investors, and they're wrong. They are wrong.
Let's look at some case studies, Veronica. What do you got for us?
Okay, so I love sort of gathering data over time, and and I first started doing this, a long time ago. But one that I thought was very interesting was when I looked at the GFC crash, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was, and that literally was only about 2 or 3 months. That lasted for October to December 2008, right? So the GFC hit, everyone, that's it. Life's over as we know it. And I actually thought that, even though I should know better, but I did. And, I looked at individual properties. There were some people who I had a friend, they sold out of Sydney. They went, it's like, it's as it's never going to get any better. They sold out and left and went regional, right? And I'm like, what do you mean it's never going to get better? It'll recover. And it did, and it recovered so quickly. In fact, I've got 2 examples of people who bought property in their worst time, right? Within 15 months, right? One had made a 38% gain and another one had made a 44% gain because they took advantage, but they bought A-grade property in A-grade area. It just happened to be people panicking and bailing out because of all the negative headlines. They bought, and then they onsold, 2 of them that onsold within 15 months. Now, similar gains have been experienced by people who bought at the very beginning of COVID, March, April 2020. Same sort of, that price falls then, actually, it only came off in Sydney anyway, about 4 or 5%. That was it. And then it bounced right back. But some people were brave enough to say, you know what, if I buy an A-grade asset in an A-grade area and I get a discount because other people are panicking, bring it on. Yeah. But if I'm also buying an A-grade asset in A-grade area and I'm going to live in it for a long period of time because it's my home, who cares, because I'm living it a long time anyway, but B, I can afford to overpay a little bit for an A-grade asset because long-term it will outperform everything else in the area.
Yep, absolutely. There's such good examples, and I have a personal example actually, and that is I purchased in October 2020. Actually sold a property at the same time, purchased another one, and that's had a 65% gain, and it's because I purchased just before things took off. Now, I couldn't have told you that was what was going to happen.
No.
I didn't do that because I was timing the market. I did it because I was ready to buy. I was in a position to. I committed to the process and I didn't worry about the noise. And I think that's the important thing, is to push all of that other stuff, the headlines aside, all that sort of stuff. You buy when you can financially afford to, when it is part of your plan, and you don't try and time when things happen. If I thought I was being smart and the market was still going to go a little bit further backwards, I actually would have probably paid between 5 and 10% more by waiting a month.
And you're never going to know when it's going to turn. Buyers who sat on their hands in 2011 and 2012, that's in Sydney, it was a very flat market. I actually I've got another personal story too to add to your one. I bought an investment property in October 2012. Now, it had been flat as a tack, really difficult to find good property when the market's flat too. So you got to know when you find a good one and act on it, because most vendors of really good properties, they know they might not get the top dollar, so they don't bother listing the property. So that's the other side of waiting. You've got less stock to choose from. But this really good property came on and I went, look, I'm going to buy it. And so I did. And I got every single cent of the growth over the next boom. I had no idea the property market was going to take off in 2013.
But we know it will.
At some point it will.
That's the point.
Yeah. I mean, look, people who sat on their hands in 2011 and 12 and then still didn't buy. Between 2013 and 2017, many properties doubled in value.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you had to be in it to win it.
Yeah. Just looking back and saying, I wish I'd bought them, or it's got to slow down and drop eventually. Out of that double in value growth, you might drop 10%, 12%. In the next downturn, but look at all of that opportunity cost of growth that you actually lost in the meantime.
Well, that's it. And if I give you some more figures around there, so Sydney median price in that boom went up 89%, right? In the ensuing downturn, which went for 2 years, it came off 15%, which is quite dramatic. But then it bounced back 12% in only 9 months. And once again, anyone trying to ride that wave would never pick any of those particular peaks or troughs.
No.
And of course, look, the one thing that every buyer wants to avoid is buying too close to the peak and immediately losing money.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that is an issue. Of course, it doesn't feel nice, right? It doesn't feel nice at all, but it is really only an issue if A, you buy crap, and B, you need to sell that
Forced
crap.
to sell in a certain market. Yeah.
Because, it can't deny it's a possibility. In fact, I did some research on 50 properties that were purchased at or near the 2017 peak in Sydney and then on sold while prices were falling. And the spoiler alert, yes, most did sell at a loss, but actually not all of them.
Right.
So whilst the Sydney median price went down 15% in that period of time, some of those people actually made a little tiny gain. And I'm not talking about renovating and selling. I'm talking about in the
unimproved.
Yeah, in the same. So it is not uniform.
But it goes back to that point. If you buy the wrong property and you have to sell it quickly, you can get caught out. And that's the thing that we talk about with timing is if you haven't got to sell at any point in time, then you can ride a market cycle. You can get past 3 o'clock, you can make it to 6 o'clock, and you can actually start to then ride the upswing if you've got a choice around when you sell. There are circumstances where you don't have a choice, and it might be divorce, it might be moving overseas or interstate or job transfer, whatever the case may be. So there are some circumstances that force you to sell at a particular point in time. And if you've chosen the right asset to start with, then the losses are going to be the most minimal of all sales in a downturn market.
I think another way to look at that too is that when you've got an A-grade property, a really good one that's always going to be in demand. So in a hot market, you have 30 people on it. In a cold market, you might have 3. There's always buyers that will want it somewhere, right? Whereas if you've got a really poor grade asset, you won't be able to find a buyer at 6 o'clock on the property clock.
Yes. And it can sit and stagnate for a very long period of time. And if you are in a forced sale situation, that can become very costly if you've just simply got to drop your price to meet the market.
So time in, that's I-N, the market is way more important than trying to time the market or timing with the G on the end, the market, because nobody, not even the experts, can get the timing spot on. Yeah. And what has the biggest impact, as we just said, is not often discussed in the mainstream media, right? It is that what you buy is what makes all the difference. And that's why if you're ready, you're financed, you need to continue looking rather than waiting for prices to fall, because it's not about the price you pay, it's about what asset you buy.
Yeah. C-grade property we talked about it becomes really, really hard to sell in a downturn. And that differential, the unrenovated properties often fall quite sharply as well, particularly if there's a shortage of tradies and prices are high as they are at the moment. But an A-grade property can go up in value even in a falling market. And it sounds counterintuitive, but if there is not enough of those A-grade properties and enough people looking for them, that's what puts the pressure on the A-grade properties, but takes a lot of pressure and a lot of buyers away from the B and C-grade properties. And you've got a case study around that, haven't you, from Lilyfield?
Yeah, look, and I'll share the links for these as well if anyone does want to read about these. The Lilyfield case study is basically 2 weatherboard houses in a suburb in Sydney called in Lilyfield, right? One of these houses I actually sold as a sales agent, basically pretty much at the peak in 2003, right? I remember this auction because it was a pretty little house, right? A little weatherboard cottage, very pretty, but it had a really small living room, really small. Like that was sort of obvious, but the market was so hot that no one seemed to care. They went, oh, I don't care, I don't care. And I remember that auction at
So we're just going to have beanbags.
Oh, yeah. And it was really well presented as well, right? The other house that I'm comparing it to was sold around about the same time, and it was nowhere near as well presented, but it was quite equivalent in terms of being a weatherboard cottage, similar size block of land, and actually had a better floor plan, but just wasn't quite as well presented. Yeah. And so that property that I sold, the pretty one with the small living area, that went gangbusters at auction. It's one of those auctions, and I remember there's a few that I sold over the 6 years that I sold property where I'd have to walk away because I had a ScoMo smirk on my face. You know, like I can't even do it. It was just so, oh my God, I can't believe what these people are paying. And unfortunately, those people, though, they went to sell. They needed to sell, I think, about 18 months later because they moved to Melbourne.
Mm-hmm.
And they came to me and I'm like, oh, dear. I knew they were not going to get back their money. And, it was excruciating because that's the worst thing as a sales agent. Because we used to joke in the office, God, I hope they don't want to sell that too soon. That was actually a joke.
Yes, yeah, which is not. It's not a joke on them. It's just it's an honest reflection on what they had to pay in that marketplace. Yeah.
And also what they paid it for, like what type of property as well. You know, we always knew which ones would sell well again, which ones like, wow, that was a fluke. You know, we did a great job for our owner, for our vendor, because that's who we were looking after back then. But
back then,
So before I jumped the fence. So, but anyway, fast forward, they had it was a 4-year period of time. So they ultimately sold in 2007. The market started recovering a little bit, but it certainly hadn't recovered to the same heights for them to get that price back. The other little one that wasn't quite as pretty, but very, very comparable in any other way, but had a better living space, it also sold in 2007. And it actually sold for more than those people paid, and they hadn't really done too much to it. And the one that I sold originally, they sold at a loss. So 2 houses, quite similar in many respects, in the same suburb. Both purchased at the peak, really close to the peak. One sold at a loss 4 years later. The other one sold for a gain 4 years later. 2 houses. So this is what I'm trying to point out, that, you know, you've got to be so careful, what you pay, yes, but it was really about the asset. The problem was the asset.
Well, and if you can overcome that, if their plan was to do a large renovation that actually changed the objection that was there, which is a small living area, if that was the plan, that actually can be turned into an A-grade asset.
Yeah.
But if it had, you know, the western rear and the overland flow and the big block of units next door looking straight into the yard, these are not things that you can change with any amount of money.
True. And in fact, in this particular case, you couldn't change it mainly because it was already maxed out.
Right. So it reached its potential.
The planning laws or regulations, so that local council had, you know, specified how much the floor space ratio, it's called, FSR, and it was already, you know, at that over that.
Right.
So that's
it. So you can't overcome that objection. That's a no-go zone.
Done.
That's a flop.
Done like a dog's dinner. So, but the reason for sharing that now is really to say that both of those people bought it at the peak, right at when the market was about to turn. And so when that's your biggest fear, that, oh my God, what if I overpay? Yes, you do not want to overpay. So you need to do the little mini course we've got, if you haven't already done it, how to price a property. So you definitely don't want to overpay, but it does very much come down to the quality of the asset.
Yeah. And look, we want to help you. We're not going to make you do anything. I want to make you make the right decisions. No. We want to help you make good property decisions. And sometimes that means buying, and other times it doesn't. We just don't want people to refrain or stop themselves from buying for the wrong reasons. So you've got to get your head out of the forecasts and get away from the media, and don't ask the Uber driver. In fact, don't even tell them that you're thinking about buying. You need to actually surround yourself with the right people who will guide you in the right way in any given market.
And not get caught in the noise.
In this episode, we've covered a very small part of our 10-step online course for first-time buyers. If you would like to learn more about the process and how to buy without making a mistake, then head over to our website, www.homebuyeracademy.com.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you like what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. 5 stars would be wonderful. It will help others find us as well.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with some more priceless stuff.